My name is Margaret Ellison, and the moment my husband called me just a housewife, something ancient and quiet inside me finally cracked. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. We were at a business dinner, not our first, not our last, but it would be the one that I'd never forget. The lighting was low, the kind meant to flatter the already beautiful and soften the not-so-beautiful. Our table sparkled with glasses of wine we couldn't pronounce, and tiny plates that looked like appetizers pretending to be meals. I had dressed with care that evening. Navy blue, not too flashy but commanding. A color that once made Richard, my husband, stop mid-sentence to tell me I looked like a storm rolling in. That was 20 years ago. Now he barely noticed if I wore color at all. Across from us sat his latest investor and the investor's wife, a lean, sharp-faced woman in gold who barely looked over 30. Her eyes swept over me briefly, then settled on her reflection in the water glass. I knew the type. I used to be the type. Richard ordered for me before I could speak. "She'll have the salmon," he said, turning to me with a brief smile. "You love salmon, don't you, honey?" I hadn't eaten salmon in years, but I nodded. He was in fine form that night, laughing loudly, gesturing broadly, bragging subtly. He was never crude about it, just polished enough to pass it off as charisma. The investor was eating it up. Then the question came. "So, Margaret, what do you do?" It was meant to be polite, a casual invitation into the conversation I had been excluded from for the past hour. I opened my mouth, but Richard answered before I could. "She's the heart of the home," he said with a chuckle. "Keeps me sane, makes sure the laundry's done, food on the table. You know, just a housewife, but absolutely indispensable." They all laughed, even the wife in gold. And I did too, the kind of laugh you master after 20 years of smiling through dismissals. But something inside me turned to ash. Just a housewife. It echoed like a slur wrapped in civility. They moved on to the next topic, IPOs and venture capital, and something about artificial intelligence, and I sat there nodding quietly, feeling my body detach from the table like fog lifting from a field. I no longer existed in that moment. I had become background noise, the polite blur beside the successful man. But what none of them knew, what Richard had clearly forgotten, was that the man sitting in front of them had once been nothing more than an anxious bundle of doubt. And I had been the one to shape him into who he was. When we got home, he loosened his tie and turned on the TV like nothing had happened. "You were quiet tonight," he said casually, flipping channels. "Tired." "No," I replied. "Just thinking." He didn't ask what about. He never did. That night, I went into the guest room not to sleep but to retrieve something I hadn't looked at in years. An old box taped shut and buried beneath childhood drawings and tax files. I carried it to our bedroom like it was a fragile artifact. And in some ways, it was. Inside were years of my life, the version of it no one at that dinner table could have imagined. Not even Richard. Notes from his first business pitch. My handwriting in the margins, adjusting the math, correcting the grammar. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., nursing our son in one arm and red-marking his presentation in the other. There were email printouts, his first investor rejection letters, his panic-filled messages. "They don't believe in me," he'd written. "I don't think I can do this." And my replies. "You can. You will. You're just not speaking their language yet. Let me show you." And I had. I built the financial model. I helped him redesign the user interface. I rewrote half of his pitch deck and even coached him on how to walk into a boardroom with his shoulders back. He once called me his secret weapon. But now I was just a housewife. The audacity of it, the erasure. It stung worse than betrayal because it wasn't just personal, it was systemic. A man becomes great, and the woman who carried him gets reduced to background noise. No name on the credits, no plaque on the wall. That night, I didn't sleep beside him. I sat by the window staring out into the darkened yard, and I thought about how many times I'd sacrificed not just my time, but my career, my ambition, my identity. I had once been a financial analyst. Sharp, precise. I was good at what I did. But when Richard's dream demanded more from me when we agreed he'd chase his startup while I handled the home, I stepped back. It was never supposed to be forever. But somehow it became permanent. Because women like me, we disappear so easily into the walls of our own homes. But not anymore. The next morning, I made his coffee, poured it into the mug that read, Boss. I laid out his gray suit ironed and crisp, kissed his cheek as he left, watched him through the window as he backed out of the driveway. But something in me had changed. This time, I wasn't going to wait to be seen. This time, I would make sure they all saw me for exactly who I was. And I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't beg for credit. Because the truth is, when a storm is quiet, it's often the most dangerous. I don't think Richard noticed the shift. That was the most insulting part, how little attention it took for him to miss that something in me had changed. He still kissed my forehead as he left for work the next morning, mumbling something about a meeting with the board. I stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, watching him disappear into the car I helped him choose. The same car I had negotiated down by $3,000 while he took a call in the dealership lounge. He didn't know I remembered that kind of thing, but I remembered everything. I walked back inside and sat at the kitchen table staring at the quiet hum of the house I'd maintained for over 2 decades. Clean countertops, a weekly stocked fridge, our son's high school photo still hanging on the wall, a house filled with the fingerprints of someone who was apparently just a housewife. That word clung to me now like smoke. I replayed that dinner party in my mind over and over. How easily he had erased my entire contribution in front of people. How confident he had been in doing so. But what haunted me more than the insult was the realization that I had made it possible. I had helped him build everything, and then I had quietly stepped aside. I wasn't bitter about supporting him. Not then, not even now. What burned was how thoroughly he'd rewritten history, how he had convinced even himself that he did it all alone. And the cruelest part, he hadn't always been like that. I still remember those early days, cramped apartment, cheap takeout containers, index cards all over the coffee table. I was 6 months pregnant and had just left my analyst job. Richard had been laid off and was trying to get his app idea off the ground. It was a mess. He didn't know how to price anything, didn't know how to pitch. The interface was awful, but I did know those things. And so I helped. Quietly, carefully, patiently. I edited. I restructured his documents. I cold emailed contacts I'd made in my previous job posing as his assistant. I even took calls for him under a fake name because he was too nervous to sound professional enough. We laughed a lot back then. We were scared broke, but close. And when he got his first seed investor, he cried in my arms, said he couldn't have done it without me. He used to call me his edge, his anchor, his strategist. But time passed. Money came. Recognition followed. And with each new layer of success, I faded a little more into the background until one day I was invisible, even to him. I pulled out my old laptop and opened a file I hadn't touched in years. It was a spreadsheet, the original financial model I'd built for his launch. Color-coded, neat, precise. Still the same format his company used today. I should have felt pride. But all I felt was silence, the kind that comes when you realize you've been the ghostwriter of someone else's success story. I clicked open more files, notes, emails, drafts I'd written. Even the name of the company, Clarion Systems, had been my idea. Richard wanted to call it Quick Bridge, something generic and forgettable. I convinced him to pick something that sounded solid, grounded, professional. He took the credit, of course, said it came to him in the shower. I exhaled slowly, closed the laptop. This wasn't just about being hurt. It was about history being rewritten while I was still alive to watch it happen. But here's the thing about being underestimated for too long, eventually it becomes a weapon. because no one expects the quiet one to act. And so I started planning. Not revenge. Not exactly. But restoration. I began by quietly auditing everything. Our bank accounts, his business filings, property deeds. I had access to most of it not because he trusted me, but because he had long since stopped paying attention to what he thought I didn't understand. But I understood more than he remembered. I learned, for example, that our shared savings account had been restructured to limit my access without notifying me. I saw the subtle shift in the way our house had been refinanced, conveniently giving him the majority equity. It wasn't illegal, it was strategic. And it told me one thing loud and clear: Richard had long since stopped seeing me as his partner. He saw me as a liability, something to contain, not to include. That's when my clarity turned sharp. If he could make these kinds of decisions in silence, then so could I. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my sister. Not my closest friend. I didn't want pity or warnings. I wanted control for the first time in years. So I started moving money slowly, carefully through an old brokerage account I'd opened before we got married and kept alive with birthday gifts from my father. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I invested in 3 small companies. One of them was started by a former colleague of mine, a brilliant woman who had always been overlooked in a male-dominated tech firm. I believed in her. She didn't know I was funding her. Not yet. The second was a legal startup that offered quiet protection to women facing financial abuse. That one felt personal. The third, a cybersecurity company run by the daughter of one of Richard's competitors, a teenage genius with no patience for ego. I liked her immediately. And just like that, the pieces began to fall into place. By day, I was the same Margaret folding laundry, attending garden club, nodding politely through another retelling of Richard's humble beginnings. But by night, I was becoming something else, the version of myself that had always been there waiting, sharp, calculating, unapologetic. I didn't want his spotlight. I wanted what was mine, and I would take it back piece by piece, starting with the truth. Because here's what Richard didn't understand. The greatest threat to a man who believes he built everything alone is the woman who actually did. There's something disorienting about living in a house you helped build and realizing it no longer feels like yours. Our kitchen, once a sanctuary where I taught our son how to stir batter without spilling and hosted long Sunday brunches, had become a place where I stood silently behind a man who didn't even see me anymore. His coffee mug sat in the same spot every morning. His keys jangled with the same careless rhythm as he left for work. Our routines hadn't changed, but the meanings behind them had. What Richard didn't realize was that he hadn't just taken me for granted. He had recast me in his story as supporting background, and now I was preparing to rewrite the ending. The following weeks moved slowly but purposefully. I began paying attention to things I used to dismiss: his phone calls, his changing passwords, his body language when his assistant's name lit up on his screen. Once upon a time, I would have blamed myself for being paranoid, but not anymore. Now I was gathering data. His company, Clarion Systems, was heading toward a major expansion. He'd been courting a major investor, someone international, discreet, very wealthy. At the dinner table, he dropped names like trophies. Chambers wants the final numbers by next quarter, he'd say, casually chewing grilled steak I'd prepared. Once that deal closes, we're looking at IPO territory. I nodded, smiled. But I knew something he didn't. The financial models he was building were wrong. His projections were inflated, not deliberately malicious, but sloppy. I knew the market better than he thought. He hadn't rebalanced for risk. He had overestimated scalability. And worst of all, he had no backup plan. Because in his mind, he'd never fail. After all, he'd built everything himself, hadn't he? I spent long nights in my study reviewing his documents, the ones he left open on our shared cloud account, thinking I never used it. They were riddled with errors. And worse, the investor he was working with had a reputation for walking away from men who couldn't demonstrate sustainable projections. I knew it would all come to a head soon, and I wasn't going to stop it. But before any of that happened, I needed to test something or someone. One evening over dinner, I leaned across the table and said softly, "Do you ever think we should rework our estate plan?" Richard blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, just hypothetically, what if something happened to either of us? Our assets? The business? Have we reviewed everything in the last 5 years?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Everything's handled. We've got to trust. It's ironclad." "I know," I said carefully. "But are my shares in Clarion still active?" His fork stopped midway. "Shares," he echoed. "Yes. From the early days. Remember, I still have the original contract. You made me a silent partner, 10% stake, I believe." He laughed nervously. "Oh, that. Yeah, I think that was just a placeholder, symbolic." "Was it?" I asked. "Because I still have the notarized paperwork." He tried to recover, but his eyes had already betrayed him. That was the moment I knew he'd written me out, not just emotionally, but legally. Somewhere between success and ego, he'd removed me from the financial narrative completely. I didn't push further. I didn't need to. He thought I was bluffing, that I'd forget, that I'd let it go. He didn't understand that I wasn't asking for clarification. I was giving him a warning. That night, I sat on the patio and let the air fill my lungs like I hadn't in years. I watched the stars. I remembered the girl I used to be, sharp-eyed, hungry for meaning, willing to give her mind to the man she loved. She was still there. But now she wanted something back. The next day, I made an appointment with a financial lawyer, one I had worked with during my analyst days. I brought a flash drive and the old shareholder agreement neatly laminated. He scanned it silently, his eyes growing sharper with each page. "This is enforceable," he said finally. "Legally, you're still listed as a founder. He would have had to buy you out formally to dissolve this stake. He didn't. Then you're entitled to everything that goes with it, including voting rights, including dividends, including discovery access to financial records." I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because of money, but because I had finally remembered my value, and I had proof. When I got home, I found Richard pacing the backyard on a phone call, gesturing wildly. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't care. Instead, I walked straight to the bedroom, opened the safe behind the bookshelf, and placed a new folder inside one labeled Clarion Ownership and Leverage. It felt poetic, like tucking a loaded weapon into a drawer no one expected. From that moment on, I started paying closer attention to his assistant. Natalie. Young, pretty, efficient, too efficient. She texted at odd hours. "Urgent. Need you to review projections for Asia division." At 11:42 p.m. I wasn't jealous. That wasn't the issue. I had moved past needing Richard to desire me. I was concerned because Natalie wasn't just enabling his incompetence, she was shaping it. And he was letting her. One night, I saw them standing too close in the hallway outside his office window, the kind of closeness that says more than words do. When he got home, I asked, "How's Natalie working out?" He looked up, startled. "Oh, she's great, smart, quick thinker." "I'm sure," I said calmly, "and loyal, I hope." He didn't respond. But that silence, that was my answer. I made no accusations, no scenes. That wasn't the point. Because this wasn't a love story anymore, it was a power story. And I was finally stepping into my role as the one who had shaped it all. Anniversaries used to mean something. At least to me. 25 years of marriage, a milestone, a marker of a shared life. But what Richard gave me that year told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in that shared life. A cookbook, wrapped in shiny gold paper, handed to me with a rehearsed smile and a kiss on the cheek. "Thought you'd love this," he said. "You're always trying new things in the kitchen." It was a collection of rustic farm-to-table recipes, charming, yes, But when I opened it, I saw the inscription, "To Margaret, the soul of our home." There was no mention of love, no memory, no personal touch, just a phrase that sounded like it had been lifted from the back of a Hallmark card. I stared at the words in silence, my hands tightening slightly around the spine of the book. He didn't notice. He was already pouring himself a glass of wine. It wasn't the gift itself. It was what it represented. After everything, the sacrifices, the years of managing his calendar, patching up investor relationships, raising our son practically on my own, while he built an empire, he thought I needed a cookbook. No jewelry, no trip, no letter, not even a simple thank you. And the cruel irony. That very same week, I had used my private savings, the little stash I'd been building from ghost consulting work, to quietly pay off the remainder of his mother's hospital bills. He didn't even know I'd done it. He'd forgotten the final invoice was due. I covered it. I always did. And he still believed he was the generous one. I stood there holding that cookbook like it was a brick. I wanted to hurl it across the room, watch it crash into the pristine white ceramic vase I had picked out for our anniversary 3 years ago, a vase he never noticed. Instead, I placed it gently on the shelf. Let it sit there. Let it gather dust. That night, we went out to dinner, his idea last minute, at a restaurant he liked. I wore a dress he hadn't complimented in 10 years. He ordered my meal for me again. Told the waiter she'll have the sea bass. She always loves the sea bass. I had stopped eating seafood 3 years ago. He didn't notice. He spent most of the meal talking about his upcoming investor pitch, the big one. I listened, nodded, asked the right questions. I even corrected one of his figures when he mentioned a projected growth rate that made no sense. He blinked, surprised. "You sure about that?" he asked. I gave him a look, the kind that cut deeper than words. He backpedaled, smiled. "Of course you're right. You always were good with numbers." Always were. Past tense, as if that skill had expired when I started ironing his shirts and baking banana bread. I wanted to remind him that his first investor signed on because I caught a mistake in the budget before he printed it. That his entire brand identity came from a late-night brainstorm we had while our son was sick with the flu. That I used to write his emails because he couldn't stop sounding desperate. But I said none of that, because now I wanted him to forget. The more he underestimated me, the cleaner my path would be. After dinner, he drove us home, hummed along to the radio, rested his hand on the gear shift like he hadn't just erased my contribution from the conversation. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw our porch light flickering. I made a mental note to replace the bulb. He wouldn't notice it for another week, maybe 2. Inside, he dropped his keys on the hallway table and kissed my cheek. "Happy anniversary, honey. Hope you liked the gift." I smiled softly. It was illuminating. He didn't catch the sarcasm. He never did. He disappeared into the living room, turned on the game, and within minutes was cheering at men on a screen who didn't know he existed. I went upstairs, took off my dress, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. There were lines around my eyes now, faint but present. Not just from age, but from squinting at spreadsheets at 3 a.m., from crying quietly into my pillow when he forgot our son's first recital, from clenching my jaw every time he introduced me as the one who keeps the house in order. I wasn't angry at the lines. I was angry at what I'd allowed. Not anymore. I pulled out the old ledger again, the one I used to track our household finances. But this time, I wasn't balancing grocery lists and utility bills. I was tracking leverage, assets, power, silence, secrets. And now there was one more thing to add. His mother. She had once told me during one of our rare quiet moments, "Margaret, you're the reason Richard's still standing." She'd said it softly, her hand trembling as I spooned broth into her mouth in the hospital bed. Don't let him forget that. I hadn't. But he had. And the fact that I had paid for her care without ever demanding recognition would now become part of my arsenal. Because this wasn't about payback anymore. It was about reclaiming authorship. The next morning, I called a woman named Simone, a discreet journalist I once helped when she was just starting out. She owed me a favor. I didn't tell her everything. Just enough to plant a seed. A quiet piece, I said. On the women behind male-led companies. No names. Just a trend story. She agreed. She always liked stories with a heartbeat. That was the beginning. And Richard? He was too busy preparing for his big moment to notice the fuse had already been lit. Money is a funny thing. You can have it and still feel powerless. You can earn it and still be told it's not really yours. That's how Richard made me feel, even as the man who only had money because of me. When we first married, we were equals not in income but in spirit. He was ambitious. I was precise. We worked together like a well-oiled clock. Every dollar was accounted for. Every financial move discussed. But over time, as his business grew and mine disappeared into diapers and carpools and late-night grocery runs, the balance shifted. I became the spender. He became the provider. And slowly, without either of us saying it aloud, he began controlling the money. He framed it as protection. "You don't need to worry about any of this," he'd say, waving vaguely at bank statements and investment summaries. "I've got it all handled." And I had allowed it. At first, it felt like trust. Then it felt like comfort. Then it became a cage. By the time our son went off to college, Richard had full control over every joint account. Credit cards in my name had spending limits I hadn't approved. When I tried to ask questions casually, gently, he would sigh, pat my hand, and say things like, "It's not your job to worry about this stuff." Except it was. Because it was my money too. He just forgot. No, he didn't forget. He just stopped thinking it mattered. I remember the moment it all crystallized for me. It was a Saturday morning. I had gone to pay a caterer for our anniversary brunch, a small gathering I had planned entirely by myself. I handed over the credit card we'd used for years, the one marked Margaret Ellison, and the charge? Declined. Twice. The caterer smiled awkwardly. "Maybe try another." I stood there, red-faced hands trembling, pretending to dig through my purse while panic swelled in my throat. I ended up writing a check from my personal account, the quiet stash I'd been building from side consulting gigs and birthday money never spent. When I got home, I confronted him gently. He laughed. "Oh, I just lowered the limit. We've been spending more than usual, and I figured it was safer." Safer for whom, I asked. "For us, of course," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Don't take it personally, Margaret. I handle these things. You don't need the stress." I smiled then. But it wasn't a smile of peace. It was the smile of someone filing something away for later, and later had arrived. Over the past few weeks, as I began rebuilding my private strategy, I had also begun requesting documents from our bank records of account changes, authorizations, fund movements. I wasn't obvious. I played dumb. I claimed I was organizing files for tax season. No one blinked. And what I found was staggering. Richard had slowly rewritten our financial structure. Over the course of 10 years, he had removed my name from 3 separate business accounts, transferred joint assets into LLCs under his control, funneled investment dividends through accounts I couldn't access. Legally, some of it walked a tightrope, not quite fraud, but not quite ethical either. Emotionally, it was theft. Not theft of money, theft of identity. He had erased my financial footprint from the empire we had once built together. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to win. I began documenting everything. Not for court, not yet, but for clarity. For power. For leverage. I spoke with an estate attorney, one I trusted from years ago. I asked him what I'd need to reclaim my financial stake legally and quietly. He looked at my old shareholder contract and smiled. "Honestly," he said, "you're still the co-founder on paper. Unless he forged a buyout agreement, you still technically own 10% of everything." He paused. "And if he tries to fight you on it, the trail of documentation you have could bury him in court." I nodded, heart pounding not with fear but with something electric. Ownership. I had it. I had always had it. I had just forgotten how to claim it. Back at home, Richard was in his office, on another call, the door closed, the same way it always was now. I passed the hallway mirror and looked at myself, really looked. I didn't see a housewife. I saw the architect of a legacy, the invisible partner who was about to step into the light. The next day, I requested a formal audit of Clarion Systems not through Richard but through the board, quietly, strategically. I sent the message through a former associate now serving as a junior board member. Just a whisper. Someone should review the risk profile. Numbers aren't adding up. No signature, no source. Just a crack in the foundation. 2 days later, Richard came home tense, tired, snapped at the dog. Didn't say why, but I knew. That night as he slept, I walked to the living room and sat in the dark. I pulled out the anniversary cookbook and ran my hand across its cheap leather cover. Then I placed it in the donation box. That was all it was ever good for. Because I didn't need recipes. I had a blueprint for war, and I was just getting started. People think betrayal is loud screaming matches, slammed doors, courtroom drama. But the worst kind of betrayal is quiet. It lives in silence. It thrives in routine. And I had spent years keeping the routine alive. Richard didn't notice when I stopped adding appointments to his calendar. Didn't notice when I forgot to forward his reminders. He thought he was the one managing everything now, so I let him believe that. Because the truth was, I had always been the one quietly holding his world together. And I needed him to feel what it was like without me. It began with small things. He had a quarterly meeting with a minor partner from Singapore, someone notoriously punctual and impossible to reschedule. I used to set 4 alarms for it, prepare his talking points, confirm time zone differences, and even print out backup documentation. This time, I did nothing. I watched him scramble out the door late that morning, his tie and his hand hair still damp. He called me from the car. "Why didn't you remind me about the Singapore call?" I sipped my tea calmly. "You never gave me the date. You always keep track." "Not anymore," I said, and hung up. I could almost hear his confusion echo through the dial tone. The next week, I didn't send the usual gift to his investor's daughter for her birthday, a ritual I had maintained for 8 years. That small gesture had been part of what kept their investment firm on friendly terms with Richard. This year, nothing arrived. Richard came home that night pale. "Did you forget Eloise's gift?" "No," I replied. "I just thought you wanted to handle things yourself." He stared at me like I had slapped him. But he didn't say a word. The unraveling had begun, and I hadn't even lifted a finger. I had just removed mine. I realized something then. Power doesn't always come from what you do. Sometimes it comes from what you choose not to do. He had always relied on my invisible labor. The reminders, the gestures, the subtle diplomacy. But he had never valued it. Because I had never made it visible. Until now. I stopped refilling his supplements. I stopped arranging the dry cleaning. When he asked why his meeting suit hadn't been pressed, I shrugged. "I assumed you'd taken care of it." He muttered something under his breath and ironed it himself. Poorly. But the most interesting shift. It wasn't in what I did, it was in how he began to treat me. He was wary, not kinder, not more affectionate, but uncertain. As if something unspoken had entered the room with me, something he didn't understand. Good. Let him feel that. One morning, I stood in the doorway of his home office and watched him fumble through a spreadsheet. The numbers were off. His projections didn't reconcile. His assistant had apparently missed a critical clause in the vendor contract. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. He looked up desperate. "Do you have a minute?" I tilted my head. "For what?" He hesitated. Just, can you look at something that was the first time in years he had asked for help. Real help. Not out of convenience, but out of need. I crossed the room slowly, sat beside him, scanned the document. You're using outdated valuation metrics, I said flatly. This entire thing is based on assumptions from 2 years ago. His eyes widened. Seriously? Yes. And Natalie should have caught that in the third column. She didn't. He closed the laptop slowly. You're right. I stood. I usually am. You just stopped listening. And I left the room. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to win the conversation, because I was winning the war. From that day on, he started watching me more closely, asking tentative questions, offering to help around the house, small things like setting the table or asking if I wanted coffee. It was clumsy, forced. Like a man trying to remember how to dance with a partner he once knew, but it was too late for that now. This wasn't about coffee, or laundry, or missed meetings. This was about respect, and he had spent 20 years squandering mine. The most telling moment came a week later. I overheard a phone call from his office. He didn't know I was passing by. He was on speakerphone with Natalie. She's not herself lately, he said. There was a pause. Do you mean your wife? She asked. Yeah, he muttered. It's like she's changed. Natalie lowered her voice, not realizing I could still hear. Maybe she's just finally seeing things clearly. That stopped me in my tracks. Natalie, smart, sleek, dangerously observant, had never been just a typist. She had ambitions. And now I could hear her laying the groundwork for something more. I stepped away before I heard the rest. I didn't need to, because now I had clarity. Richard wasn't just vulnerable. He was surrounded by people who only respected him when he looked powerful. And without me behind him, he wasn't powerful at all. That night, I sat in bed alone while he fell asleep in the guest room, something he started doing more often without explanation. I didn't mind. The space gave me room to think. I pulled out the folder again, the one with all the documentation, the contracts, the bank transfers, the audit trails, the timelines. My proof. My history. I didn't know yet how I would use it, but I knew I would. Because men like Richard don't understand the value of a woman until she stops explaining herself. And I was done explaining. I had warned him once. He called me dramatic. I had helped him once. He called it luck. I had loved him deeply. He called it obligation. Now I was going to show him what it really means to be just a housewife. You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat their assistants. When Richard hired Natalie, he praised her like she was some gift from the heavens. Sharp, he said. Efficient. Easy to work with. Translation, she made him feel important. At first, I thought she was harmless. I even encouraged him to delegate more. I was tired of being the one doing everything behind the scenes while he got the glory. But over time, the late-night texts started. The quiet phone calls. The locked phone screen whenever I entered the room. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. And instinct is never wrong. It began one night after he came home late again. His excuse was that he and Natalie were burning the midnight oil prepping for the Chambers pitch. His shirt smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. Not strong, but just enough. Enough for a woman like me to recognize a territorial move. I didn't ask questions. I didn't accuse him. I just smiled, kissed his cheek, and helped him take off his tie. Let him think I was still soft. Still asleep. But behind my calm was calculation. The next morning, I checked the call logs on our shared phone plan. Richard wasn't smart enough to get a separate burner or unlinked devices. And there it was, dozens of late calls to Natalie. Some as late as 1:30 a.m., some on weekends, one on our anniversary night. I printed them. Not because I needed proof of an affair, because I needed proof of dependency. Natalie wasn't just flattering him. She was becoming his handler, his fixer, his enabler. And men like Richard, they always replace women who challenge them with women who applaud their mediocrity. But Natalie didn't know what I knew. She didn't know how many passwords I still had access to. She didn't know I had watched Richard build this company from a napkin sketch in our living room. She didn't know the real story. And she certainly didn't know that the woman he called just a housewife was also the woman who wrote his first client contracts from scratch and saved him from a breach lawsuit by spotting a clause he misread. So I watched. I listened. One afternoon, I went to Clarion Systems under the pretense of bringing him a forgotten file. Natalie met me at the reception desk, glossy hair blouse, just a little too open smile, a little too calculated. "Oh, you didn't need to bring this yourself," she chirped. "I was in the area," I lied smoothly. "Besides, I used to come here all the time, remember?" She blinked, unsure whether that was a threat or nostalgia. I handed her the envelope. It was empty. "Could you make sure he sees this right away?" I asked, voice light. She nodded. "Of course. He's on a call, but oh, I'll wait." I took a seat in the lobby, waited 30 minutes, enough time to let her sweat. She finally returned. "He says he'll call you later." Of course, I smiled. He's a busy man. I stood slowly. "You know, I remember when this lobby had folding chairs and broken blinds." She blinked again. I helped him pick the paint, I added casually, back when he still asked me what I thought. And with that, I left. It wasn't about marking territory. It was about reminding Natalie that this story didn't start with her. And it certainly wouldn't end with her. That night, Richard didn't mention my visit. But he was quieter than usual. Ate dinner slowly, checked his phone every few minutes. He knew I knew. He just didn't know what I knew. And that was the most powerful position to be in. In the days that followed, I began pulling away even further. No more cooking, no more laundry, no more coordinating dinners or family schedules. He tried to act like he didn't notice, but the cracks showed. One morning, he asked if I had confirmed his flight to San Francisco. I didn't even look up. "I'm not your assistant, Richard." He flinched. "Well, I just assumed." "That's your problem," I said flatly. "You assume I'll do everything." He stared at me. "What's going on with you lately?" I set my coffee down and met his eyes. "I've stopped pretending you built all of this alone." He didn't respond. He didn't know how. Because for the first time in our marriage, I had said it out loud. That night, I heard him on the phone again. With Natalie. He sounded nervous. Defensive. "She's acting different," he said. Colder. There was a pause. "Do you think she knows about us?" I didn't need to hear the answer. I walked away. It wasn't about them. Not anymore. It was about me. Because while he had been flirting and flailing, I had made significant moves. I had converted my quiet investments into a formal LLC. I had secured my shareholder voting rights through the company's bylaws. I had initiated a private audit of Clarion's IP contracts. And most importantly, I had reconnected with our son not as the shadow behind Richard's empire, but as the woman who had helped build it. He was older now, working in finance, smart and observant. "Mom," he said on the phone one evening, "I've always known you were the real brains. He talks too much to know what he's saying half the time." I laughed, but something in me softened. For years, I had felt erased. But my son had been watching. And now, he was the one helping me quietly position myself for what was to come. Because Clarion Systems was approaching a precipice. The Chamber's investor wasn't biting. Revenue was slowing. And Richard, for all his bravado, had started relying on Natalie for more than just attention. He was drowning. And I was going to let him feel the weight of every inch of it. Because men like Richard forget who steadied the ship. Until the storm comes and they realize the wheel is in someone else's hands. While Richard paced the halls of Clarion, whispering with Natalie and juggling slipping investor interest, I was building something of my own. It started simply with 3 folders on my desktop, each marked with nothing more than initials ELRV and KN. They weren't names of people Richard knew. They weren't even people who'd ever met him. But they were women, strong, brilliant women, each of whom reminded me of the version of myself I had buried for decades. EL was Evelyn Long, a former colleague from my analyst days. She'd started a boutique investment advisory firm after leaving a toxic corporate role. She had grit, but no capital. I quietly became her silent partner. I knew she'd make it. She always had the numbers in her bones, just like me. RV stood for Rosa Villanueva, a tech founder creating secure platforms for survivors of financial abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had found her by chance a blog post gone viral buried under algorithms. She needed a sponsor. I sent her an anonymous offer through a private legal firm. She never knew it came from a woman in pearls and a cardigan who once made small talk at charity luncheons while bleeding internally. KN was Kira Nguyen, a 22-year-old cybersecurity prodigy. Her product A software that detects breaches not just in data, but in behavior. I saw a demo once quietly through an invitation-only webinar. Investors laughed her off as too young, too ambitious. I didn't. I reached out through an alias, offered a partnership. She didn't care who I was. She just wanted to build. All 3 ventures were growing, and with each month so did my returns. Not just financial, but personal, purposeful. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't a shadow. I wasn't behind a man. I was behind something I believed in. I started using my maiden name in correspondence just to feel the syllables again. Margaret Hale. I hadn't said it aloud in over 20 years. Now it felt like breathing. And I wasn't hiding. I just didn't need to shout. Let Richard think I was still quietly folding laundry while he stumbled through another client call. Let him think I was watching reruns while he flirted with a girl young enough to be our daughter-in-law. Because while he was busy playing CEO, I was becoming something far more dangerous, independent, invisible, in control. One afternoon, while pruning the garden, I got a call from Evelyn. Still anonymous, I see, she teased. But I wanted to let you know we landed our biggest client yet. All thanks to that expansion capital. I smiled. You earned it. There was a pause. Can I ask you something? Of course. Who are you really? I hesitated, then answered, just someone who forgot what she was capable of. Until now. She didn't press further, and I appreciated that. That evening, Richard came home flustered, his tie loose, his shoes scuffed. They're asking more questions, he muttered. Chambers. Legal wants another review before next quarter. The projections are fine, but they're not fine. I interrupted, pouring myself tea. He stopped. Excuse me. You're still using growth assumptions from a pre-pandemic curve, and your user acquisition model doesn't reflect current burn rate. He blinked. How do you know that I looked at the deck you left open last night, and I remember how to read a spreadsheet? He stared at me, stunned. You're not mad about what he looked down. Natalie, I offered gently. His silence was an answer. No, I said, setting the cup down. I'm not mad. I'm just done. With what? Pretending I don't know everything. He sat down slowly, like the weight of it had finally reached his bones. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did, I interrupted. Maybe not maliciously, but you meant to forget me. Me, the woman who built this life with you, who saved you from yourself more times than you even noticed. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I never saw it that way. That's the problem, Richard. You never saw me. He looked like he might cry. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but I remembered something else. Every apology that only came after he suffered. Every hug that followed after I fixed his mess. Every kiss that tasted like manipulation, not affection. I stood. I'm not leaving, but I'm also not waiting anymore. You'll feel it. Slowly, quietly, but you'll feel it. And I walked away. Back upstairs. Back to my laptop. Back to the empire he never knew I was building in parallel. Later that week, I received a report from Kira's firm. One of the accounts linked to Clarion had been flagged for suspicious behavioral activity. I read the report slowly. The flagged profile belonged to Natalie. I smiled, not because I wanted to see her fall, but because I knew now what I had suspected all along. She wasn't in it for loyalty. She was in it for the win. And soon, when the tower fell, Richard would turn to the only person who ever truly held the foundation steady. And I wouldn't be there. Not to catch him, but to watch him land exactly where he left me, unseen, underestimated, and alone. It's one thing to be dismissed by your husband. It's another to hear your child echo his words and realize he's learned to see you the same way. It happened on a Sunday over brunch. Our son Daniel had stopped by, a rare visit these days since he was working in Chicago, always busy, always in motion. I had made French toast the way he liked when he was little. Richard barely looked up from his phone. Nothing new. We were chatting idly when Daniel said something that stopped the air in the room. "Dad, I can't believe you built all of this from scratch." He said it with pride, with admiration. He meant it as praise. But I froze. Richard smiled humbly, brushing it off. "Well, you know, lots of hard work." I waited for him to say something, anything to acknowledge what I had done. But nothing came. No glance in my direction, no shared memory. No, your mom helped too. Just the two of them, men speaking of conquest while I sat across the table like part of the furniture. I smiled, but my throat tightened like a fist. "Actually," I said slowly, "it wasn't just hard work. It was strategy, risk modeling, relationship management, timing. Your father's not good at timing. That was always my job." Both of them looked up. Daniel blinked, surprised. Richard looked embarrassed. "Margaret." "No, go on," I said, keeping my voice level. "Tell him who found your first investor, who restructured your pitch deck, who stayed up at night correcting your numbers because you couldn't get them to reconcile." Daniel looked between us, uncomfortable now. "Wait. Mom, I'm the reason your father didn't go bankrupt in his second year," I said. "But don't worry. It's easy to forget the woman behind the curtain when the spotlight's warm and bright." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Daniel set his fork down. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," I said, still smiling. "I was always too good at disappearing when it was convenient." Richard pushed back from the table. "Can we not do this now?" "Oh, you don't want to talk about this in front of our son?" I asked, voice still sweet. "But you had no problem letting him think I was just the one who packed his lunch and vacuumed the rugs." "Mom," Daniel said quietly, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "You didn't know," I said, "because no one ever told you." He nodded slowly, then turned to Richard. "Is that true?" Richard looked down at his hands, said nothing. And in that moment I saw something in our son's eyes I hadn't seen since he was a teenager: disappointment. A crack in the illusion. And it broke me. Not because I wanted Richard to suffer, but because I realized something deeper. My silence hadn't just cost me recognition. It had rewritten the narrative of our family. After Daniel left, the house was painfully quiet. Richard came into the living room holding a cup of coffee like a peace offering. "I didn't mean to erase you," he said softly. "But you did," I replied. He nodded. "I guess I just took it all for granted." "That's not good enough anymore," I said. He sat down across from me. "So what now?" I looked at him for a long time. "I don't want revenge, Richard. I don't want to fight. I want truth. And I want it public." His face paled. "What do you mean?" I said, "you're going to correct the story. In front of your partners. In front of our son. In front of the world if need be." "That'll make me look weak," he muttered. "No," I said. It'll make you honest, which might be a first for you. He stared at me like he was looking at a stranger. But I wasn't a stranger. I was just the woman he stopped seeing, and I was finally done being invisible. Later that evening, I sat with Daniel on a video call, told him the whole story, not just the facts, but the emotions, the sacrifices, the years of quiet labor. He listened, really listened. And then he said something I'll never forget. Mom, I don't know how he survived without you. I smiled, tears burning behind my eyes. He didn't. He just never realized I was the reason he didn't drown. I didn't have to destroy Richard. All I had to do was step back and watch him do it himself. He had no idea how much of his success depended on things he never even saw. And once I stopped protecting him, the cracks widened fast. First came the calendar errors. His assistant Natalie double-booked him with 2 different partners, one in New York, the other in Seoul. He missed both calls. One investor pulled out entirely, the other postponed indefinitely. Richard came home red-faced, tossed his briefcase on the floor like a child in a tantrum. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Why would she?" "Because she's not me," I said, not even looking up from my tea. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "that she's only efficient until something goes wrong. Then she blames the algorithm." He said nothing. I took a slow sip. Then came the client fallout. Turns out I wasn't the only one Natalie had mismanaged. She had promised deliverables Richard hadn't even approved. Misquoted a proposal. Failed to secure an NDA. A longtime client filed a formal complaint with the board. That's when the email started. Not to me, of course, not directly. But I had my eyes everywhere, one from the legal team. "We were not made aware of any changes in contract language. This may result in a breach." Another from finance, projections are off by nearly 17%. "Did someone authorize a revision without notifying operations?" And the final one, the one that made me laugh out loud, was from Chambers himself. "I'm beginning to wonder who's really running the show at Clarion." I almost replied. Almost. But no. This had to come from Richard. He had to feel the weight. All of it. And so I watched. From the kitchen, from the garden, from the other side of the room, while he sat hunched over his laptop like a man drowning in data he couldn't interpret. At night I could hear him tossing and turning, not from guilt, from panic. Natalie, for all her charm, had begun to distance herself. She wasn't stupid. She saw the writing on the wall. Their late-night calls grew shorter, her voice cooler, her tone more professional. Eventually, he said it out loud. "Natalie's been distracted lately." I didn't even blink. "Or maybe she's realized how fragile your empire is." He sighed. "Margaret, I know we've had our tension, but you've got to help me. Just for now. Just until we stabilize." I looked up slowly, setting down my cup. "Help you?" I echoed. "You mean, like I did when I rewrote your first contracts, or when I found your second investor, or when I paid your mother's hospital bills while you bought a luxury watch to impress a venture partner?" He went silent. "I mean," I added, "I could help, but I'd need something in return." He narrowed his eyes. "What ownership?" I said. "Public. Documented. Acknowledged. Not just in spirit on paper. And a statement to the board correcting the narrative." He laughed. "You're serious?" "Completely." He rubbed his temples. "Margaret, you don't know what kind of damage that could do. Investors don't like uncertainty." "Oh, I agree," I said. "Which is why I'm giving you the opportunity to make this clean, dignified." He looked at me like he was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time in years. "Who are you?" he whispered, and I smiled. "The woman you married. The one you mistook for furniture." I left him with the paperwork. 3 days later, he presented a revised organizational chart to the board. He credited me with co-founding the company. He reinstated my shares. He issued a formal apology in the next quarterly newsletter, brief, but real. And he stood in front of our son and said, "Your mother is the reason I ever had a chance at success." I lost sight of that, but I see it now. Daniel nodded. He looked at me proud, not just of what I'd accomplished, but of who I'd become. After the meeting, Richard approached me quietly in the hallway. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm sorry." "I know," I said. "But this doesn't change everything." "I know that too." We stood there in silence. Then he asked, "Do you still love me?" I paused. "I love what we once were," I said. "And I love the woman I had to become to survive what we became." He nodded, and I walked away. Not with bitterness, but with something he'd never again take from me: power. It was strange at first to hear my name said aloud in a boardroom. For so long I'd been the silent partner, not in contract but in consequence. I was the woman who made everything work while Richard stood in front of the cameras and claimed the light. But that morning, I walked into Clarion's glass-walled conference room and saw my name printed on the agenda: Margaret Ellison, co-founder, discussion. And there it was: acknowledgement. I took my seat at the far end of the table where I used to sit when no one noticed I was even in the room, just the wife. But now they waited for me to speak. I looked around. The boardroom was full. Partners, legal, finance. Even Chambers had flown in wearing his usual smug detachment. Richard sat beside me, nervous, his tie too tight, his face strained, his confidence frayed at the edges. He had opened the meeting with a brief statement. "Before we begin, I'd like to correct an oversight, one that's gone on for too long." And now it was my turn. I stood slowly the way I used to when presenting to executives in my old career before I gave it up to be a homemaker. "Thank you," I said. "I won't take much time. I simply want to say that Clarion didn't begin with venture capital or a fancy pitch deck. It began in a living room, on a borrowed laptop, with two people, one with a vision and the other with the skill to make it real." I paused, letting the silence fill the space. I was the second one. And I'm here to reclaim that part of the story, not out of pride, but out of principle. Some of them nodded. Some looked embarrassed. But all of them were listening. I sat back down. That was all I needed to say. Because the truth had power, especially when it had been buried for so long. After the meeting, Chambers approached me. "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" he asked. I gave him a smile I'd perfected over the years. "Because I thought loyalty would protect me. Turns out loyalty only matters when it's mutual." He gave me a rare, measured nod. "You're formidable," he said. "I've always been," I replied. "Most men just don't notice until it's too late." And with that, I left. That week, the media got hold of the shareholder update. One article made its rounds: Clarion Systems co-founder steps forward after 2 decades in the shadows. They quoted my statement. They called me the backbone behind the brilliance. And while I didn't need the spotlight, I allowed myself one small luxury. I printed the article, framed it, and placed it in the study right next to the empty frame that once held Richard's Entrepreneur of the Year plaque. He never asked what happened to it. But he saw it. I made sure of that. Natalie by then had quietly stepped away from the company. No fanfare, no farewell email, just gone. She didn't return my calls. She didn't need to. Her part was over. Richard, to his credit, began trying to repair what he'd broken. He started scheduling meetings with me, asking for input, listening in that overly careful way men do when they realize they've lost ground they can't get back. One night over dinner, he asked, "Do you think we'll ever get back to what we were?" I chewed slowly, set my fork down. "No," I said. "But we might build something different." Better. I looked at him for a long moment. Wiser. He nodded. I'd take that. But inside I wasn't sure what I would take, or what I even wanted anymore. Because as I stood in my own name again as my inbox filled with speaking requests and consulting offers as my identity expanded beyond the roles of wife and mother and shadow, I realized I didn't need to go back. I had outgrown the woman who once waited to be seen, and now the world was finally looking. I didn't expect the invitations to come so quickly. The week after the shareholder announcement, my inbox was flooded podcasts, women's leadership panels, venture groups. They all wanted the same thing, a story. My story. The one I had never told, not even to myself. And for the first time in decades, I said yes. Not for fame, not for revenge, but because silence had cost me too much. And I wasn't going to pay that price again. The first event was small, a local women's business summit, nothing flashy. The kind of conference where they served coffee in paper cups, and the folding chairs wobbled if you sat the wrong way. But the women in that room, fierce, raw, tired of being unseen. I told them the truth. About sacrifice. About love turned into labor. About how ambition doesn't always scream, sometimes it whispers through spreadsheets at 2 a.m., and invisible hands holding empires together. And when I was done, they stood up. Every one of them. Afterwards, a woman my age came up to me with tears in her eyes. I thought I was the only one, she whispered. You're not, I said. We just never learned how to speak our own names. The next week, Evelyn called. You know, she said, we've got a board seat opening. Non-voting. Advisory for now. You interested? I laughed. Let me think about it for 30 seconds. Yes. She chuckled. I thought you might say that. The offer wasn't about ego. It was about coming full circle. Once upon a time, I had stepped away from a rising career to support a man I believed in. Now, I was returning not as someone trying to prove herself, but as someone already proven. I told Richard over dinner. He blinked, fork midair. You're joining Evelyn's board advisory for now. He hesitated. You'll be amazing. It almost sounded genuine. Almost. He was trying. I gave him that. But something in me had changed so completely that even his compliments felt like echoes from another life. I didn't need his praise anymore. I didn't need his permission. What I needed was time to explore who I had always been before I let myself become small. I started waking up earlier. Not for chores or obligations, but for myself. I walked. I journaled. I sat in silence with my own thoughts and realized they were no longer filled with resentment. That was the miracle. I wasn't bitter. I was clear. Our son Daniel came home that weekend. He pulled me aside while Richard was in the garage fiddling with some project he would never finish. You seem different, Daniel said. Lighter. I am. He nodded. I always thought you were the quiet one. I was, I said. Until I remembered I didn't have to be. He hugged me, tighter than usual. Before he left, he handed me a wrapped box. Inside was a plaque. It read, "Behind every great man is a woman who made it happen. But sometimes she's not behind him at all. She's already ahead." I cried when he left. Not because I was sad, but because someone had finally seen me. Really seen me. Not as Richard's wife, not as Daniel's mother, but as Margaret. Just Margaret. And that was more than enough. I didn't announce it with fanfare. There was no grand reveal or power play. Just a quiet, formal document slipped across a mahogany table. Richard stared at the envelope like it was something radioactive. "What's this?" he asked. Brow furrowed. "My terms," I said. He opened it, read slowly. There were 3 pages. Page 1, a legal transfer of voting rights for my shares in Clarion, giving me independent authority. Page 2, a financial separation agreement, not a divorce, but a full division of assets. Page 3, a list of conditions, personal ones. He read in silence. This is, he began. This is permanent. Yes. You want a legal wall between us? No, I said. I need it. He looked at me like he was hoping I'd flinch, like this was a test. But I didn't. Because the truth is, Richard was still hoping we could go back to the version of us where I did everything and expected nothing, where he could disrespect me in public and apologize in private. But that version of me had died in silence, and this version, she didn't come back to negotiate. You'll still live here, he asked softly. For now. Until I decide otherwise. His mouth opened, then closed. He knew better than to argue. I wasn't threatening him. I was freeing myself. That night I slept better than I had in years. There was no triumph in it. Just peace. And peace for someone who's lived in someone else's shadow is more powerful than any revenge. In the weeks that followed, I watched as Clarion slowly recalibrated. Investors grew more cautious. Natalie disappeared entirely. No announcement. No farewell. Just an empty chair where a young woman once sat thinking she could replace a legacy. Richard stumbled through it, humbled quieter. But I didn't watch him out of cruelty. I watched to remind myself how fragile empires can be when they're built on borrowed strength. And I began building my own. With Evelyn's board seat, I gained visibility. With Rosa's tech firm, I began investing more deeply. With Kira's cybersecurity startup, I helped negotiate their Series A funding and doubled my return. I wasn't just helping other women rise. I was finally allowing myself to rise too. One afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror buttoning a navy blue blazer, the same shade I'd worn the night Richard called me just a housewife. But now the woman in the reflection didn't look like someone clinging to dignity. She looked like someone who owned the room before she even walked in. I received an invitation that evening, a keynote speaker role at an upcoming Women's Economic Summit. I smiled, accepted. It was time the world heard what quiet women have always known. We're not background, we're foundation. And when we rise, the whole house stands straighter. The day Richard stood on that stage and said my name, the world shifted. It was the Clarion Annual Conference, a marquee event with media investors, tech influencers, even city officials present. In past years, I stayed home during these things. I ironed his shirts, double-checked his notes, and watched the live stream quietly from my laptop while he shined in front of a sea of applause. But this year, I stood behind the curtain, my name printed on the program, my seat reserved in the front row. He hadn't wanted to do it, not at first. His PR advisor insisted. It's the right story now. You've already updated the records. Why not lead with it? What he didn't say aloud, but what we both knew was this. The company's future depended on this moment. On him rewriting the past in public. The lights dimmed. Music swelled. Applause rose as Richard stepped onto the stage. I watched from the wings, arms crossed, face unreadable. He stood before the crowd in his navy suit, but for once he looked smaller. Not weak. Just real. He started the speech the same way he always did, talking about growth, innovation, the journey. But then he paused. He looked toward me, then down at his notes, and set them aside. There's something I need to say, he began. Something I should have said a long time ago. The room stilled. Clarion didn't begin as a solo vision. It wasn't built by one man pulling brilliance out of thin air. It was built in a living room, at a kitchen table, with someone who understood the world better than I did, who corrected my numbers, guided my ideas, and made sure I never fell apart, even when I thought I already had. He swallowed hard. Margaret Ellison isn't just my wife. She is the co-founder of this company. She is the reason I'm standing here today, and she deserves to be recognized not as my supporter, but as my equal. A slow wave of applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger, louder. He looked back at me. Our eyes met. And in that moment, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt seen. Not in a spotlight way, not in a romantic way, in a human way. I stepped forward, walked onto the stage. The applause intensified. Richard reached for my hand. I didn't take it. Instead, I turned to the crowd and nodded once. Then I walked off the stage, calm, composed, powerful. The next morning, the headlines rolled in. Clarion co-founder finally gets her due. The silent architect behind a tech giant speaks up. Margaret Ellison rewrites the rules of recognition. I received more messages than I could count, from women, from men, from people who had built their lives quietly and were only now finding their voices. But one message stuck with me most. A handwritten note delivered to my door in a cream envelope. Thank you for reminding us that silence doesn't mean absence and quiet does not mean weak. R.V. Rosa Villanueva, my partner, my friend. I placed the note in my drawer alongside my first investor contract, my original business model, and the corrected projections I once printed for Richard before he ever stepped into a boardroom. My archive of quiet proof. But I wouldn't need it anymore. Because now, the world knew. People often ask me now if I ever regret staying. Not staying married, that's a different question, but staying quiet for so long. Staying invisible. Staying behind. And the truth is, sometimes I do. I regret how many times I shrunk myself to fit his vision, how many celebrations I planned from the kitchen while he stood at the podium. But I don't regret the journey that brought me here. Because without that silence, I might never have heard the sound of my own voice when it finally returned. I live differently now. The house is still the same, but something in the air has changed. The energy is mine again. I move through it with purpose, not obligation. My days are filled with calls, strategy sessions, and boardroom meetings, not as an assistant, not as a wife taking messages, but as me. Margaret Ellison, founder, partner, investor, architect. My name carries weight now. Not because it was given to me, but because I took it back. Richard and I live more like diplomatic roommates than husband and wife. There is civility between us. A quiet recognition. Sometimes he brings me coffee now without me asking. Sometimes he asks before he speaks. It's subtle. Late, but not meaningless. One evening, he stopped by my study doorway. I saw the keynote you gave last week, he said. You were extraordinary. I looked up. Thank you. He lingered. Do you ever think about us? I do, I said. And I think we loved each other in a way that made sense back then. But I also think we were both playing parts. You played the man in charge. I played the woman who made it all look easy. He nodded. You were better at your role. I know. He smiled faintly. I never stopped being proud of you. And for once, I believed him. Not because he said it, but because I no longer needed him to. A week later, I received a letter from a university I once dreamed of attending before I gave up my seat to follow Richard across the country. They'd read about my story and wanted me to speak to their graduating class of women in business. This time, I didn't hesitate. On the day of the speech, I stood in front of a sea of young faces full of hope, potential, and uncertainty. And I told them what I wished someone had told me. Don't confuse silence with grace. Don't confuse support with surrender. Don't confuse loyalty with disappearance. And most importantly, don't ever forget to sign your name on what you help build. They stood. They clapped. And for the first time, I cried on a stage. Not because I was sad, because I was finally home. Later that night, I returned to a quiet house. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelf where the cookbook once sat. It's gone now. Donated. Replaced with a small plaque gifted by my son. To the woman who built an empire and never asked for a throne. I smiled, traced my finger over the lettering. Because I never wanted a throne. I only wanted to stop being the floor beneath someone else's feet. And now I walk through my life upright. seen, steady. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the greatest success is not recognition, it's reclamation. If you've ever been the quiet one in the room, the one who made everything run while someone else took the credit, this story is for you. Subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories like this, where silence ends and strength begins. Tell us, have you ever helped someone succeed only to be forgotten in the credits? How did you take your power back?